I will introduce myself. My name's Alysa Fornarotto-Regenye, and I've actually been in the addiction field for 30 years. Right out of college, I graduated with my degree in education from Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. And then when I moved back from Rhode Island, unfortunately, there were no teaching jobs. There were like major layoffs during that time, right shortly before that. So luckily, fortunately for me, the business administrator in my community knew who I was because I had worked, my summer job was working for the community. And so he offered this job as the BRIC Alliance coordinator. And I said, I don't know anything about addiction, but I'll learn if you send me. So from that point on, that was the trajectory for my whole entire 30-year career. I actually received my substance awareness coordinator certificate in 1993. So I had my BS in elementary education. I received my SAC. Then I earned my MSW in the administration policy and planning track with children and families as my focus from Rutgers University. I also went on to get my LCADC. I was one of the first LCADCs, as well as CPS in the state of New Jersey. And then I also have my school social work certificate. So those are my credentials. Like I said, I'm 30 years in the field. So I started as the BRIC Alliance coordinator. From there, I was recruited to a hospital system to do marketing community relations for substance abuse and mental health. From there, I was offered a position with ADACO, which is no longer in existence, but that was a sister network to Prevention First, believe it or not, at one point. And I was there while I was doing my master's full time. And then I was offered a job with the state for the Division of Addiction Services. I worked under the Office of Prevention Services for 6 years, and then another 5 years under the Office of Treatment. I actually was the first SPIF-SIG manager. I wrote the SPIF-SIG grant that brought in $10.5 million into the state of New Jersey for prevention services. That's still rolling out today. I also co-wrote the very first epidemiological work group report, profile substance abuse report. And I'm getting a poll here. And from there, I was there at the state for 11 years, and it was time to come home because I had 2 small children at the time. And I took the job here at Wall Township High School as a SAC, and I've had a very blessed career in the addictions field. I wouldn't trade it, and I'm always trying to convince people to go into this field. So I'm also the chairperson currently, chairperson of the Monmouth County Board of Addictions, and I also sit on the Ocean County Licata. In terms of marijuana, this is a passion for me. I have provided personal testimony on how marijuana has impacted youth. And I've provided that testimony to Senate hearings multiple times across the state over the years. And I've even provided my own testimony in my own community to our mayor and council in Toms River. So from that point, I'm going to move forward because I talk every single day with adolescents on the topic of marijuana and how it impacts their brain, because we know that marijuana is the most widely used substance among adolescents. They tend to go from the nicotine and they graduate onto the marijuana. And believe it or not, when they become chronic nicotine users, it's not long before they actually move on to marijuana. So I cover all the substances when I go into the classroom, but I focus a lot on marijuana. Okay. So let's see here. Trying to advance. Why isn't it advancing for me? Okay, so I do think it's worth noting some of the data that we do have, because we don't have all the data from DOE. They haven't released the more recent years of data, but I think it's significant to show you that just from 2017-18, incidences of substances across our schools for marijuana, it was 2,876. And just from that number to 1 year later, it jumped to 4,189. That's a significant increase, okay? Just from 2015-16 to 2018-19, that's actually an 84.5% jump increase in marijuana substances being an incident in schools across New Jersey. And those are only the students who get caught. So just keep that in mind. Let's see here. Okay, so this is a report from JAMA, Journal for American Medical Association. And what we have here, it says, so marijuana users ages 12 to 17 have double the prevalence of a use disorder. That means a clinical diagnosis out of the DSM-5 compared to nicotine, alcohol, and most drug user categories, even prescription users. So we need to keep that in mind, especially when we're talking about youth. So this is the healthy brain development between at 5 years of age to 20 years of age. So just keep that in mind as I move forward, because I'm going to show you many slides of the brain and how it's impacted. So one of the things that I talk about with my students and with parents and staff is that our brains are walking chemistry labs and walking computer labs. So while our brain actually produces its own natural mood regulating chemicals, our brains are generally hardwired a certain way, but obviously we're all a little bit different. But when we start to put toxins, whether it's nicotine, alcohol, marijuana, or any other drug into our system routinely, you actually start to change. You're actually training your brain to lower the production of certain chemicals in your brain. So marijuana is actually one of those toxins that will teach your brain to lower the production of magnesium. So what do people take magnesium for? Often they take it for anxiety or depression. So keep that in mind as we move forward and we learn more about what's going on with the adolescent brain. Okay, so at birth, there's a lot of things going on at birth, a lot of pruning in the early stages, and then what you see is a lot of growth up through 7 years of age, and actually even through 12 years of age. Usually around 12 years of age is when our brains start to go through a pruning process. It's kind of like when a gardener in the fall prunes back stuff that is, the areas of the bushes that are dead, and they prune them back. Sometimes they cut the rose bush back to 2 feet. And then in the spring, the rose bush comes back beautiful and stronger, healthier, greener leaves, beautiful flowers, right? That's kind of the way that our brain works. So our brain actually goes through a pruning process from about 12, it says 15, I'd say maybe even 12 years of age. Some studies say 12, up through, some say 24, but more recently I'm reading even up to 28 years of age. So 24 to 28 is about the time that our brains really slow down their development stages. So right now, adolescents, they're at their prime for development in their brains. So I try to teach kids everything you expose your brain to, whether it's something that you're consuming, inhaling, or even just the messages that our brain is taking in all day long. It's modifying the brain pathways. So that's where that hardwiring comes into play. So hardwiring plays a big role. I'm going to show you a video real quick. It's Dr. Levine. He's going to talk about how some discoveries that he made. Originally, he was looking at nicotine, but what he realized in the long run is that the adolescent brain doesn't need substances to actually modify itself. It's to make it more sensitive to substances. It's already primed for addiction before putting any toxins into their bodies. So let's watch that real quick.
I think more and more now people see addiction as a developmental disorder. We think about addiction as something that just happens to adults, but in truth is, it really has its roots stemmed in adolescence. That's when most of the people who become addicted try drugs. For example, if you start using an illicit drug before you're 18, we have a 25% chance of becoming addicted. But if you start using an illicit drug after the age of 21, you only have a 4% chance of becoming addicted. So adolescence is a crucial time for the development of addiction. And I started to become very interested in that because I looked at the effect of nicotine on cocaine, and I found that actually nicotine has a very unique ability to basically loosen the DNA. And Eric was talking about gene expression, and when that DNA is loosened, what happens is that when cocaine comes along, then there's a much more massive increase of gene expression that's related to addiction. And in my research, I started looking at the effect of nicotine specifically on cocaine, and I found that nicotine has this effect that it increases gene expression that's related to addiction. But what I found actually later in adolescence was something very different. I didn't expect that. I thought that nicotine would do that even more so in adolescence. But I found something very different, because when I looked at the adolescent brain at baseline, I saw that the DNA was already loosened up in that particular area in the brain, in the nucleus accumbens. So at baseline, the adolescent brain is much more sensitive to the effect of almost any other drug of abuse. And so if you expose the adolescent brain to any of those drugs, you'll get more of that growth that Eric described, because the DNA is more open, basically open to soaking up new experiences. So this is the compact DNA that you see that oftentimes in adults. And what I saw in adolescents was a very different picture. It was something more like that, a much looser DNA. So the gene expression, so the genes that are over there basically can get expressed a lot more in that particular stance when it's more loose.
So, so basically, you know how we learn how to ride a bike? The only way to really learn how to ride a bike is by doing it over and over. And as you start to learn how to ride a bike, the only way is practice, right? Practice makes perfect. So the more you practice, the more your brain is creating those pathways, right? So if it's kind of like someone who retires at age 65 and they decide they're going to learn how to paint. My husband's uncle is an amazing painter, and he didn't start until after he retired. Never touched a paintbrush in his life. He would have told you he was never artistic. But he started doing it. He does it every week. He paints with a friend of the family, and he's amazing. So it's because he started building new pathways the more he did it. It's kind of, unfortunately, the same way with drug addiction. So the more that you're using, the more that you're teaching your brain how to build those pathways, right? Not to mention that we're also increasing the receptors in our brains for those drugs of abuse. This is just another slide to show you how changes to the brain circuits take place with repeated drug use. The brain grows more dependent on the drug use and needs larger quantities to achieve the same effects. So structural damage like brain shrinkage, otherwise known as cerebral atrophy, occurs as a result of addiction. If I'm going too fast, just let me know. I just want to make sure that I give myself enough time and Arnold enough time. Okay, so now we're looking at this slide. So this, and you can't really, I feel like I want to move this down here. Okay, so study shows a long-term marijuana use changes brain reward circuit. So here, what we found out in this study, and this was it was by the Center for Brain Health at the University of Texas at Dallas, and they studied 59 adult marijuana users and 70 non-users. So what they found was that marijuana use affects the region of the brain called the orbital frontal cortex. So, the prefrontal cortex, we know that is here, and that prefrontal cortex is, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive functions, right? Everything that we do in our jobs is generally, we're using this part of our brain, and we're adults. Whereas adolescents use the amygdala, the mid part of the brain. The amygdala, that's where all of the, the major emotional part of it takes place. But the high risk taking, the pleasure seeking, the moods, up and down moods. So that's where adolescents are working out of. So if you can understand that piece of adolescent brain development, that they're functioning from the mid part of the brain, we're functioning from this part of the brain. Now, when you use marijuana, just so you know, whether it's alcohol, marijuana, or whatever, this is the first part of the brain that actually gets impacted by the toxins. So that's why judgment is the first thing to go when you're using substances. So the orbital frontal cortex, it regulates behaviors such as adjusting socially and controls responsibility, motivation, and mood. And what they found is that there's less gray matter in that area, which is really important when it comes to looking at the brain scans. It says the orbital frontal cortex had lower gray matter density. In other words, it was smaller in pot users than in non-users. And we know that chronic pot users, that their brains actually shrink in size. They change the shape and the texture of them change. And we can see this all with brain scans, which is phenomenal. Okay, great. Hold on. Where is it? All right, so I just wanted to show you this real quick. This is a brain that is not being impacted by nicotine. I'm sharing this with nicotine only because, oh, this is the smoker. This is a non-smoker. Sorry, I can't say this. So look at the difference. And I show this to kids, and when they actually see these brain scans and they're like, wow, there really is something going on in my brain. That's really important. It's, it's biofeedback. This is something else for you to look at. This is a brain that has no nicotine in it. This is a brain that took one puff. Okay, this is a study, and this is one puff after taking nicotine. This is 3 puffs. This is 1 cigarette, and let me move this, and that's 3 cigarettes. So that's a pretty drastic change in the way that your brain is being impacted by nicotine. And I want to use that because a lot of people think nicotine isn't an issue, and it is. The same thing with alcohol. When we abuse any kind of a toxin, we're impacting the shape of our brain, the texture of our brain, the hardwiring, everything. And all of these craters and holes that you see there for alcohol, this actually applies to every toxin across the board, whether it's nicotine, alcohol, marijuana, opioids, meth, anything, any toxin we're talking about. If you take too much of anything, it could be too much of Xanax, a prescription. It doesn't matter what it is. Too much of it is going to do damage. And all of those craters represent parts of the brain that have been turned off. It's almost, the way I describe it to kids and parents is that it's almost as if you take a volume dial and you turn it all the way off. And there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to turn that volume on over time. I've had students, unfortunately, who've abused their bodies to substances over the years. And later on, after they've had years of recovery, they've shared with me that unfortunately they still don't have their short-term memory. Some of them don't have all of like that. They haven't really gotten back like that affect to show like emotion. So everyone is impacted differently. Okay. So here I want you to look at this. This is the callosum fibers. And it says white matter structure differences between marijuana users and non-users. So here you have a lot of nice, colorful fibers showing up in this brain scan, but here it dwindles. So that's some more biofeedback for that person who is a heavy marijuana user, a daily user, that it's impacting, changing their brain. And there's no guarantee that they're going to have, that their brain will be able to recover. Yes, our bodies are meant to heal ourselves, but there's just no guarantee depending on what age you're at when you started using, depending on the potency of the drug, the type of drug. There's so many different factors that go into it. Okay, hold on. So we want to talk about. So this is a 16-year-old who abused marijuana on the weekends, and as you know, as blood flow drops in the brain from chronic use of marijuana, so does our IQ drop by 8 points if you're a chronic marijuana user. So that's really serious. Let me just see, I'm gonna go back. Let me go here. Okay, so here's another brain scan. So this is actually a brain scan of someone who has schizophrenia on the left. This is a brain scan of someone who did not have an organic diagnosis of schizophrenia, but they were a daily marijuana user right here. So unfortunately, so you have the marijuana user, and I mean the person who has schizophrenia here, and unfortunately the marijuana user's brain has been impacted where it actually resembles someone who has schizophrenia. So this speaks to, the reason I'm showing you this is because it's speaking to the fact that our adolescents who are heavy chronic users, many of them are developing psychosis. Their brains are more sensitive than adults, and they're actually developing schizophrenia on a more permanent basis. Whereas an adult, we might have episodes of schizophrenia if we took high dosages of marijuana, but it's not going to necessarily be permanent. For an adolescent, there's a very good chance of it. Also know that heavy use of THC under 18 years of age, you are 6 times more likely to develop schizophrenia. Teens who use marijuana regularly, chronically, unfortunately, they are 60% less likely to complete high school or college, 8 times more likely to use other drugs, and 3 times more likely to become addicted to heroin. And we know that, you know, the THC receptors in the brain, they kind of work collaboratively with the opioid receptors in the brain. Hold on one second, I'm trying to do this. Okay. Sorry. So we also know that teens who use marijuana on a regular basis have an increased risk of THC-induced psychosis, which I talked about, schizophrenia, and or permanent impaired cognitive functions. And unfortunately, they're 7 times more likely to attempt suicide. So this is a slide on marijuana toxicity, and I think it's important to mention. So some of the things to look for is rapid heart rate, hallucinations. These are different ways that anyone's body with too much marijuana in it will be impacted. Hallucinations, mental confusion, anxiety and panic attacks, extreme paranoia, seizures. Sometimes they'll go into a catatonic state. And I actually have had students over the years share with me that they've witnessed their friends go into a catatonic state. And that's where you might be awake, but it's like you're frozen in time. So the kids might say like they just kind of like froze for 30 seconds, or maybe they froze for 3 minutes, and they started drooling. And we kept trying to like shake them out of it, but they weren't coming out of it. And I had to explain to them that that's called a catatonic state. And it's really dangerous because you could be in a catatonic state for 30 seconds, for 3 minutes, for 3 hours. I mean, there's no guarantee how long you could be stuck in that state. Remember, we're walking chemistry labs, walking computer labs, and you're putting a toxin into your body. It depends on the potency, it depends on the amount that you put in your body. So you just never know. It causes extreme confusion, increased blood pressure, and severe nausea. I will say that I had a parent share with me one time that their daughter, who was not a substance abuser at all, but was babysitting. And she went to babysit a 1-year-old. The family, the parents of the 1-year-old said, listen, you know, help yourself to any of the snacks in the cupboard. So at one point she decided she got the brownies out of the cupboard. She actually did give a little piece to the 1-year-old. Thankfully, the 1-year-old never actually consumed it. But unfortunately for this girl, she actually ate 2 of those brownies. So it you know, when we consume edibles, there's a little bit of a delay before it gets into our bloodstream. So that's why after the first brownie, she didn't feel any different. So
Alysa,
later on, it kicked in. Yes.
We have a question for you, Rhonda, which
Sure.
is a good question.
Sure.
She wants to know, does a daily user have the psychosis during the use or permanent side effect?
I would say I would say yes to both. So I would say while you're under the influence, if you have a high dosage in your body, you can go into like I was saying before, a catatonic state. Depending on how long you've been using heavy, using the marijuana can bring on hallucinations and other psychosis type of symptoms. But again, you could be completely, let's say you haven't used in a couple of days. Because if you've abused it for so long, you've changed the chemistry and you've changed the hard wiring and you've impacted. Remember the slide that I showed you side by side, I showed you the healthy brain versus the brain, the organic the brain that was diagnosed with schizophrenia. It was an organic case of schizophrenia versus the brain that the adolescent was mimicking schizophrenia symptoms. So when they did the brain scan, they actually could see where that brain had been impacted by the THC. So does this make sense? And that can be permanent. We have an increase in adolescents that are being diagnosed with schizophrenia, not necessarily with having, being predisposed to mental health conditions in the family lineage either. Is this
Yes,
good?
she said, thank you. And we have someone else that shared that I've witnessed youth in substance-induced psychosis working in inpatient. I saw upwards of 2 days to 2 weeks of the psychotic symptoms in them, and that's just until they're discharged. So I did not see the long-term effects.
Right. Right. So thank you so much for sharing that information, because it's great to have someone working in the field in a facility, especially inpatient residential, to actually share that information as testimony. So thank you. If the marijuana is laced with other drugs, some common adverse effects can include seizures, strokes, or irregular heartbeats. I mean, obviously, if it's laced with fentanyl, something like fentanyl, obviously death is a possibility. And in 2021, alone, the New Jersey Poison Control Center assisted in the medical treatment of more than 150 children who ate cannabis edibles. Of these, nearly 100 were aged 5 years old or younger. So we have to be, as we move through this legalization process and rolling everything out, we really have to take a step back and think about how we want our laws to look like in order to protect our youth. This is, okay, let me just move this a little. So specific long-term effects on the brain. So as you can see, I'm not going to go through all of these because I'm talking about them anyhow, but it's a nice visual that you will have in your handout. Just know that. Okay. So marijuana's impact on the body. So it impairs your memory. And remember, I think I told you earlier that marijuana, just like alcohol and other drugs, it impairs your body in the same order. So our brains develop from the back to the front, but when we put toxins into our body, it impacts our brain from the front to the back. So the front is judgment. It works its way back to the control center of all of the major organs, right? So it affects memory, event recall, judgment, cognitive functions, coordination and balance, increased heart rate, dry mouth, some occasional chronic anxiety, fear, panic attacks, depression, as well as seizures. I will tell you that what I see in kids is I see kids who have high anxiety, they have panic attacks, they have deep depression. I see a lot of that as a long-term impact of kids who use chronically. Okay, let's see here. Sorry, I keep moving everything around. Okay, so there is such a thing as marijuana withdrawal. Many people think there is no such thing, but that's a fallacy. It is more similar to nicotine. So by the second or third day, that's when the withdrawal symptoms will be at their worst, most likely, just like nicotine. But it can take up to 2 weeks for you to go through a full withdrawal process. So when you do go through a withdrawal, you could experience craving, anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, and mood changes, and I have them highlighted for a reason. Increased aggression, but you can actually experience increased aggression while you're under the influence, and that's something that when Colorado first legalized, I believe that they had many adults who were trying it for the first time since they were kids. And remember, they're thinking that the marijuana is going to be the same experience that they had when they were teenagers back in maybe the 70s or 80s. And it's a completely different drug. This is THC on steroids now, so it's completely different. So they had a lot of for a while there, they had a lot of adults actually having like situations where 911 had to be called because someone became very erratic and very aggressive towards the people around them because they were using that concentrated form of marijuana that they've never used before. And remember, chemistry labs and computer labs, so we're being impacted that way. There's irritability, sweating, and a running nose. I can tell you, I've seen kids exhibit this sweating and the runny nose. like sweating. If you see this picture here from that, remember the airplane, the comedy airplane? Kids, I've seen kids just, they said, Mrs. Regenye, I don't know what happened. I was just sitting in class and all of a sudden I just started pouring with sweat and I don't know why. So that might be, it seems like random, but then I start asking them questions and then the conversation completely turns into something different. Loss of appetite, nausea, insomnia, restlessness, and strange, sometimes they have, those strange dreams. Some long-term impact, lowered IQ, I already talked about. Increased aggression, sterility issues. And I think adolescents need to know this, because if they plan on having a family in the future, they need to know that they might actually be impacting their ability to have children. So there are plenty of studies out there that it decreases sperm count in men. It defers ovulation in women. Cannabis addicted pregnant women are likely to give birth to babies with developmental problems. And I will tell you that one of the Senate hearings years ago, maybe 2016 or 17, one of the Senate hearings that I spoke at and gave testimony at, there was a woman at the end of the Senate hearing. It might have been at Rowan. I'm not sure which location. It might have been Rowan University it was at. And this woman came up to me and she was from Colorado. She had MS. So she started using marijuana for MS. But then she got pregnant and the doctor said, oh yeah, it's not a problem. You can continue using the marijuana during your pregnancy. It won't affect the baby. Well, she came up to me and she said, I want to thank you for all that you shared, because I was one of those people who had MS and I was taking it, for the MS, but then I continued during marijuana at the advice of the doctors. And my child had all sorts of developmental issues. And unfortunately, what was shared with her was that it was the continued marijuana use during pregnancy that actually impacted her child. So she was there to actually speak up against marijuana after she had been using it, after she was told that it was safe for her to use for all that time. Also, some long-term effects are difficulty in the immune system. So it is harder for you to fight off infection. Often chronic marijuana users develop chronic bronchitis. Okay, so this is a slide on the progression of addiction. A lot of you may have seen this in different ways, but I've kind of tweaked it over the years because it helps me explain things better to kids and parents. So you have your initiation and you move all the way down to the dependence where you need it, right? But I always talk about this, it's kind of hard to catch kids at the very beginning in the experimental age, at the experimental phase. Social, recreational, as a SAC, I might hear things, someone might say something to me, but I feel like I'm often getting kids referred to me during that problem use stage. And I tell kids in classrooms, in the health classes, and I talk to kids one-on-one, and I tell parents one-on-one, when they get to the point where they're using, even if you're using every weekend, you're building the tolerance 3 to 4 times a week. Now you're doing you're actually, at this point, you're really making some major change with your chemistry and your hardwiring. And then obviously it just gets worse from there. But I like to show this because I feel like it helps them to understand that and the progression of addiction. Okay, so chronic marijuana use alters female reproductive system. I'm not going to read this. I have this in the slides for you to read later. It's more about that study, but I wanted to plug that in for you. So that I have it for the female reproductive as well as the male reproductive. Okay, so hyperemesis syndrome. This is from using too much marijuana chronically. And yes, I've had students positively diagnosed with this. And actually, I didn't start having kids diagnosed with this until I guess it was about 2016 when I really started to really delve into the whole, we were having so many kids in 2016 showing up in school under the influence with marijuana across New Jersey, right? And I started seeing a pattern happen. I've seen a couple of patterns happening in the school buildings, and not just me, but other sects. So I started doing some research, and what I found out was about hyperemesis syndrome, where the stomach illness stemming, it's heavy use. I'm going to show you this video. One of the things that I ask kids, if I get a sense that they're chronic users, I actually ask them. I say to them, I know this is going to sound like a strange question for Mrs. Regenye to ask you. I want you to know it's for a really good reason. But I want you to answer honestly. And at the end of this conversation, I may say to you, listen, we need to have a conversation with your parents because you might actually have a medical condition. So I'll ask them this strange question, which is, do you ever find yourself having like frequent hot showers, like really scalding hot showers, and not understanding why because you never did in the past? Do you ever find yourself having a hot shower, maybe getting out of the shower, and maybe a half hour, you're like, I need to go back in the shower, but it's because it's all kind of connected to your digestive tract, and you get these heavy stomach pains and cyclical vomiting. And when I say this stuff, they're like, oh my gosh, like that's so weird that you would ask it, but yeah, how do you know that? And then I explain to them and then I show them this video that I'm going to show you. And then we have a conversation with their parents. I have not had a lot of kids diagnosed, thankfully. I do believe part of it is because parents and kids are assuming that there's a digestive issue, so they bring them to the gastroenterologist. I will tell you that these kids did positively say to me that they don't share with their doctors or their parents that they're using marijuana. So it's a guessing game. The gastroenterologist, they'll do diagnostic tests, but nothing on diagnostic tests actually show anything wrong with their system. So this is happening to them. So I'll tell the kid, you have to be honest with your doctor. You need to tell them the truth. So once they actually explain this, and not all honestly, I did a couple of years back, I started cold calling doctors' offices, primary care and gastroenterologists, as well as pediatricians. Only 2 doctors' offices from Monmouth and Ocean actually knew what cannabis hyperemesis syndrome was. So we have to do a better job at educating our medical field. Just know that. And I tell parents that, like, your doctor may not know what this is, so I give them the information to share with the doctors. So let's look at this video real quick.
New laws going into effect mean that in the new year, marijuana will be legal for recreational use in 8 states, plus the District of Columbia. In states where pot is legal, doctors are seeing an increase in a violent illness. Dr. John LaPook takes a look.
I thought I was dying.
For more than 2 years, Lance Crowder was having severe abdominal pain and vomiting. No local doctor could figure out why. Finally, an emergency room physician in Indianapolis had an idea.
And the first question he asked is if I was taking hot showers to find relief. When he asked me that question, I basically fell into tears because I knew he had an answer.
The answer? Cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS. It's caused by heavy, long-term use of various forms of marijuana. For unclear reasons, the nausea and vomiting are relieved by hot showers or baths.
They'll often present to the emergency department 3, 4, 5 different times before we can sort this out.
Dr. Kenan Hurd is an emergency room physician in Aurora, Colorado. He co-authored a study showing since 2009, when medical marijuana became widely available, emergency room visits for CHS in 2 Colorado hospitals nearly doubled. In 2012, the state legalized recreational marijuana.
It's certainly something that before legalization we almost never saw. Now we're seeing it quite frequently.
Outside of Colorado, when a patient does end up in an emergency room like this one, the diagnosis is often missed. Partly because doctors don't know about CHS, and partly because patients don't want to admit to using a substance that's illegal.
CHS can lead to dehydration and kidney failure, but usually resolves within days of stopping drug use. That's what happened with Crowder, who's been off all forms of marijuana for 7 months.
Now all kinds of ambition has come back. I desire so much more in life, and at 37 years old, it's a little late to do it, but better now than never.
CHS has only been recognized for about the past decade, and nobody knows exactly how many people suffer from it. But as more states move toward legalization of marijuana, emergency room physicians like Dr. Hurd are eager to make sure both doctors and patients have CHS on their radar.
Dr. John LaPook. John, thank you.
So this is a study that actually, the study was in Canada. And so this researcher wanted to see what was worse. Is alcohol worse on the brain, or is marijuana worse on the brain? So I'm going to show you this.
The legalization of cannabis is clearly building momentum in the U.S.
California will become the 8th state to legalize recreational marijuana.
For the first time, you can buy marijuana legally in parts of Colorado.
The state of Oregon
legalizing marijuana for recreational use.
And in Canada, which is the first G7 country to legalize it for recreational use.
Fewer than 12 days and counting before marijuana becomes legal in Canada.
Obviously, cannabis will still be illegal for minors in Canada, as it is in all US states that have legalized it for adults. Still, a new study exploring the effects of the drug on teenagers' developing brains serves as an important reminder to policymakers. The analysis found the short and long-term impact of cannabis on teens' working memory, reasoning, and habit-breaking abilities was worse than that of alcohol. The study was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry.
We had actually expected alcohol to have a bigger effect on cognitive development, because at the time there was a lot more known about the effects of alcohol on cognition, less known about cannabis.
Patricia Conrad is the study's lead author and a professor of psychiatry at the University of Montreal. Her research surveyed and tested almost 4,000 students in the Montreal area over 4 years, starting when they were around 13. While the negative effects of cannabis were more pronounced than those of teenage drinking, more students reported consuming alcohol than using cannabis. But Conrad says that could change, as studies have found the legalization process in Canada is increasing interest in cannabis.
Adults and young people become more and more comfortable with cannabis, have more liberal views about cannabis use, and do increase their use through that process.
The study is one of a kind because it tracked the relationship between teenagers' cognitive abilities and substance use over time, revealing how long-lasting some of the effects were.
This study really highlights the need for young people to consider delaying the onset of cannabis use for as long as possible during the adolescent years.
One of the study's most troubling findings was that teenagers who used cannabis had less inhibitory control than those who didn't. And less inhibitory control, which is the ability to stop one's habitual behavior, means a greater likelihood to develop addictions later in life.
This might be one mechanism by which early onset alcohol and drug use, particularly cannabis use, is implicated in future risk for addictive behaviors and cannabis dependence.
Conrad stresses that her study should not be used to morally condemn cannabis, especially at a time when more and more Americans view it favorably. Still, acknowledging the health risks associated with the drug is as important as ever.
Is it morally any different than using alcohol or tobacco? No. But that's not to say that it doesn't have health risks. There is no doubt that THC is an addictive substance. Depending on how it's ingested, it could have respiratory and carcinogenic effects, and that shouldn't be underestimated. So what's needed next, I think, is a study that's designed in a very similar way, but that will test the extent to which cannabis has these kinds of effects in adults.
Another recent study says the link between young adults' cannabis use and cognitive deficits may be, quote, overstated. But previous research shows that cannabis use among teens could lead to an increase in suicide attempts and psychotic episodes.
I hope that's helpful to you to see that that's not the only research out there that is coming up with this conclusion that cannabis has a more long-lasting impact in terms of the way that it's changed hardwiring and everything in your brain, and how it's causing permanent damage to the brain. So let me move on. We're almost through this. Okay, so this is a slide. I'm going to show you this real quick. This is actually, I would highly recommend you see this. The full video is 27 minutes. I make any student who gets in trouble in my building for substance use or is referred to me for marijuana use, not necessarily violating the school policy. I always show this to them. I always show it to their parents. It's a 27-minute video about how the Schulich School of Medicine in Toronto, Canada, actually came to Colorado when Colorado first legalized to do their research on Colorado. And so they studied these 4 adults who would smoke pot in this research project, location. I think it was only one day. It was only a one-day study, but they studied the brain waves. And what they noticed is that as the adults continued to use more of the marijuana, they were literally having moments of psychosis. So in the brain waves, you would either see a spike or a dip or a break in the wavelength. So each one of those represented a type of psychosis. But what they said was that Dr. Stephen Laviolette, who I've actually had the privilege of co-presenting with virtually over the years, we've probably presented maybe 4 or 5 times together now. What he says is that the marijuana in adolescent brains is a permanent, like the psychosis is permanent. Whereas adults, our brains will recover as soon as the marijuana finally exits out of our system. Our brain can go back to normal the way it was before. But with adolescents, when you're using over and over, because they are going through such a sensitive brain development stage of life, it's actually changing their brain as we speak. So it's just like everything we do on a daily basis is our brains are like sponges and changing our brains in different ways. Only this is to a much more detrimental level. So I'm going to, oh shoot, I thought I had the, hold on. I thought I had the shorter version, but I'm just going to show you real quick. I'm just going to skip through certain parts. And I have to, hold on, stop, and then share.
And CBD were in almost...
Okay, hold on.
This is what the inside of your washing machine looks like after 1 year. And it's not dirt from your clothes, it's a colony.
Equal parts,
hold on.
About 4% in most weed.
I'm going to show, so if you look here, you can see like
brain.
dips.
How are you feeling?
Breaks,
I'm feeling pretty high. I'm glad I didn't
spikes.
smoke any more than I did. But I'm also feeling pretty focused and ready to go.
How you doing, Audrey? You all right?
I'm really not feeling good.
What do you mean by not feeling good?
I don't know, like, all I can think of is just weird. Like, I don't know how to describe it. Just, like, trapped, kind of?
I would prefer that she didn't continue, I think. I think she looks like she's a little bit panicked right now.
You want to go outside for a second?
I kind of, like, feel like I want to, like, leave. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to fast forward now to the point where she ends up coming back in. But I'm going to fast forward to another spot where this journalist, investigative reporter, is now speaking to Dr. Laviolette.
For that, we're going back to Canada, where the brainwave data will be scrubbed and analyzed and sent to London's Schulich School of Medicine.
So this is the main lab where we do most of our electrophysiological work.
Top Canadian neuroscientist Stephen Laviolette researches marijuana's effects on the brain, and he's discovered a troubling trend.
If you're exposed to high levels, especially of THC, you can experience the sort of temporary symptoms associated with schizophrenia, sort of cognitive impairments, paranoia.
Okay, hold on. Schizophrenia?
Yes.
Does he also see that in the brain patterns of our Denver smokers?
Based on the brainwave activity, this individual is showing the sorts of disturbances in gamma activity that might be reflective of what we see in schizophrenia.
Does that mean that this person has schizophrenia?
No, definitely not. So schizophrenia is a long-term sort of chronic disease. They're not having a long-term, lifelong disability, but they can certainly experience psychotic-like episodes that might last for a couple hours.
Laviolette sees schizophrenia-like patterns in all the participants' brain waves after smoking, not just Audrey's, who experienced that panic attack. Because they're all adults, their brain waves will return to normal. But for teenagers?
The adolescent brain is most vulnerable. So the adolescent brain is going through a period of all sorts of changes, all sorts of important molecular changes, structural changes.
Would you tell a young person under 25 with a developing brain to not smoke, to not use weed at all?
Yes, I would. It's simply not worth the risk.
Not worth the risk? Well, that's a problem in Canada, where young people already smoke
fast
more
forward a
weed
little.
than any other teens in the
Okay, so
developed
this
world.
is Josie we're going to focus on right here.
But do we really know what today's potent weed does to young brains?
So I smoked weed for the first time, like the last day of grade 9, And by the time I started school in grade 10, I was smoking every day.
And I see that that's pretty
You're
typical.
14, grade 10 starts, you're still smoking, you're smoking every day.
I start to notice that I'm like very self-conscious, very anxious, and then that turns into paranoia. And then the paranoia increases to sort of delusional thinking. So thinking that people are inhabiting my body or they can hear my thoughts.
That must have freaked you out.
It did, yeah. It really did freak me out to the point where I asked my mom to hospitalize me.
Josie had cannabis-induced psychosis. She spent 2 months in a youth and adolescent psychiatric ward. Do you have a better sense of what caused what happened to you?
I believe the weed that I was smoking was too strong. And I found that after smoking that kind of marijuana, the psychosis would come on immediately.
Josie's mental health doctor at the time was Sharon
I'm gonna
Cerrone.
skip over
She
this a
sees
little for
patients
time.
like Josie all the time.
I'm going to show you this
We
part.
just head down here. And CBD were in all.
Is precious. It matters. How things turn out for you matters.
But has pot always had such a dark side? Back in the 70s, the THC was about 4%, but there was also something called CBD in the weed. And THC and CBD were in almost equal parts, about 4% in most weed. So what exactly does CBD do? Neuroscientist Stephen Laviolette tests both THC and CBD on the brains of teenage rats.
So these are a key part of the experiment? Absolutely, yes. These are adolescent rats.
What have you found with the rats?
Well, CBD is really fascinating. And we've actually shown that it produces the opposite effects of THC. So it actually counteracts the effects of THC in many different ways. Giving them CBD was actually able to reverse a lot of those effects, those schizophrenia-like effects.
We keep hearing that today's weed has a lot more THC. So what about CBD? Hoping to find out, we bought 12 popular strains from different Toronto dispensaries.
Have a great day.
Killer Pink. What's the THC? The CBD. We're packing them into separate Ziploc bags. Sample 8. What's it called? God's Green Crack. And taking them to the lab to be tested for both THC and that CBD. Five days later, test results are in. Let's take a look at what they have to say. First up, the THC. That's that high-producing chemical. You know, the levels of it are actually quite high, up to 30%. But the CBD, not detected, not detected, not detected. It's just not detected at all. And the CBD is the thing that keeps the anxiety away, and there's none of it there at all.
And that's quite remarkable, really.
No detectable CBD. Now, what does that mean?
Well, it means it's been bred right out of the plant.
We talk to young people with cannabis-induced psychoses, with anxiety issues, all sorts of things. What is the chance that it's because the strain they've been using has next to no CBD?
CBD is known to basically block those effects. And if you're smoking something that doesn't have any CBD in it at all, there's basically nothing to sort of take the kick out of the THC that you're getting from smoking that particular strain.
And there's another worrying effect of the high THC, especially when there's no CBD.
You're dramatically increasing the addictive liability because that's what's going to be ramping up the brain's dopamine sort of addiction pathway.
So the higher that THC, the more addictive it can become.
Absolutely, yeah. So levels that are higher in THC, those are more likely to lead to substance abuse type problems.
Try this 90-second trick to instantly reduce your winter energy bills by 85%. This jet.
I don't think it's addictive to everybody, but I identify as having an addiction to marijuana. I feel like I'm living my life with one hand tied behind my back sometimes.
It's been 8 years since Josie's first psychotic break. She's had 2 more since. A lot of people are going to be surprised that you kept smoking pot.
I'm surprised that I kept smoking pot. It's addictive for me. It's habitual. I personally have a very difficult time stopping.
And Josie is not alone. Almost 1 in 5 teens who use marijuana become addicted.
Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead.
So for now, like it or not, we're all part of this big experiment. Today's pot is stronger and readily available, and for some people, like Josie, life-changing.
I definitely feel like it's impacted my health in a lot of ways, my memory, my motivation, and then, yeah, this psychosis. So,
In your mind, is pot a bad thing?
absolutely not.
Is it a bad thing for younger people?
I do think so because your brain isn't done developing. It's as simple as that.
Okay. Let me stop sharing that and go back to my presentation. Okay, so if you noticed in that video was all the way back from 2016. So they probably recorded it maybe early 2016, maybe late 2015. And if you remember correctly, the reporter actually stated from what after they sent the marijuana out to be tested for THC levels and CBD, and there was no CBD in any of them, the THC level in that flower was 30%, and that was way back in 2015-16. So we're here in 2021, and I could only imagine how much stronger the THC is in the flower now. And maybe there's someone in the audience who has something that they'd like to share. I've heard some research say that I do know that they did have, back in 2016, I had seen a video where they had a marijuana festival and a contest, and it was at 37% back in like 2016. So I'm going to guess to say it's much higher now. Maybe it would show up as 50% now, THC with no CBD, which is a problem because that's high potency. That's the flower form, and it's the constant. Josie talked about the she didn't say what it was, but she said a more potent form. That's the concentrated form. That's the wax form. That's the vaping form of THC. That is what, 98% THC, maybe higher than that, and no CBD. That's what's causing so much mental health in our students and our adolescents, and ending them up in treatment and mental health facilities. So real quick, I just wanted to show you this real quick. I know that in the state of New Jersey, they have had drug seizures where marijuana has been laced with fentanyl. I think a couple years ago, the New Jersey DEA has had a drug seizure with marijuana in every form of marijuana, like edibles, flower, concentrates, and they all had traces of fentanyl in them. So that's adding another layer of safety issues. Also this past spring, Special Agent Susan Gibson from the New Jersey DEA did a press conference, and she had shared that fentanyl-laced drugs, fentanyl is laced in drugs across the different types: OxyContin, Percocet, cocaine, marijuana, etc. And 96% of heroin recently seized in New Jersey is laced with fentanyl. That was something that I found in the news, which is just tragic to our youth. I also want, I think with 2 more slides, that's it. CDC says that marijuana users are 3 times more likely to become addicted to heroin. And let's not forget about the athletes who use marijuana, who are training their brains, and then they get hurt, injured, have surgery, and they're placed on an opioid. And I could tell you that it only takes the 3rd dosage of an opioid for your body to build a tolerance. And for Xanax, it's only after the 2nd dosage for your body to start building a tolerance. So we're really sensitive, whether you're an adult or a kid, to that stuff. An estimated 3.2 million Americans over the age of 12 are currently misusing pain relievers. Among 12 to 25-year-olds, 840,000 are current misusers. We know that xylazine is being also laced in marijuana and other drugs, fentanyl, and we're prepping our kids for addiction. And this goes back to how our adolescents' brains are primed for addiction. So with that, I'm going to hand it over. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to say thank you so much for giving me this privilege of presenting to you, and I hope you did get something out of it. Feel free to contact me in the slides, the handouts that you're going to get emailed to you. My contact information is there. Thank you so much.